Let's get started on Chapter 1, Overview and Installation. In this section, we will discuss the purpose of Windows Server, the additions of Windows Server, installation, initial configuration tasks, navigation, installation methods, and server core. Let's start out with the purpose of Windows Server. Windows Server is a network operating system. And as you know, the purpose of a network operating system is to control and coordinate the hardware, software, and data components of a server. Windows Server can function as a file server or a domain controller, which is also known as a login server, or it can function as a DHCP server. It can perform a variety of roles. And this introduces the term server role. A role describes the function the server performs, such as the file server role, or the domain controller role, or the DHCP server role. When it's performing the DHCP server role, it is issuing IP addresses to workstations. There are three general categories of server roles. There is directory services, and that includes the domain controller, which, as you know, is the login server. And there is the infrastructure service, which would include DHCP server, DNS server, Windows deployment server, Windows services update server, and remote access server. And application roles included web server, print server, file server, and remote desktop server. Windows Server can perform any one or all of these roles. Windows Server is a network operating system. It is a platform onto which you can install roles. And when we say role, we mean the function that the server is performing. Let's look at the additions of Windows Server. There is the Data Center Edition, Standard Edition, Essentials, and Foundation. And Essentials and Foundation are for small business, no more than 15 or 25 users. Most of us will be working with the Standard and Data Center Editions. The Standard Edition functions as a standard corporate server. It can act as a domain controller, or it can function as a DHCP server. It can be a DHCP server, or it can be a file server. Now, the Data Center Edition does everything the Standard Edition does. The Data Center Edition is what you would install on a big old data center server that had a large number of CPUs, a large amount of RAM, and which would be running a large number of virtual machines. The key difference between the Data Center Edition and the Standard Edition is this: the Data Center Edition can run an unlimited number of virtual machines. Let's look at some of the prices. If we look at the price of the Standard Edition, we see $600. I guess that's not too bad. But if we look at the price of the Data Center Edition, that's $10,000, and that's for the software alone. And then, of course, each user must have a CAL, a client access license, and that can cost $39 per client. To download a free copy of Windows Server, and Microsoft wants you to do this, so you will practice with it. You go to www.microsoft.com under Server and Cloud Platform. Under Windows Server 2012, we click on Try It, and we select Download the Evaluation Windows Server 2012 Release 2. Notice step number 2 says register and then download and install a fully featured software for the 180-day trial. Register means you have to create a username and password on Microsoft's website. And it is a full-featured, it is not a student edition. It's a full-feature copy of Windows Server, and it's good for 180 days. And then after 180 days, theoretically, you like it, and then you buy the license for that server, only $10,000, or as a student, what you would do is just reinstall it. You download the ISO image, then you burn it to DVD, then you use the DVD to install the operating system on the server. Installation. We have system requirements and installation procedures. The system requirements, the bare minimum required for Windows Server is a 1.4 gigahertz 64-bit CPU, 512 meg of RAM, and 32 gig of disk space. And you might say, my laptop computer has more processing power than that. Well, this is only the bare minimum that you would have to install Windows Server. You would never really install Windows Server on a computer which had so little processing power. Even if you had a small server, you would want to have a dual core 2 gigahertz processor, or 4 gig of RAM, or a 500 gig hard disk. And of course, if you had a large data center server, you might have 64 quad-core CPUs and 4 terabytes of RAM and multiple 2 terabyte hard disks. And of course, this is what we do have at our data center at CCBC. But the bare minimum required to install Windows Server is 1.4 gigahertz, 64-bit CPU, 512 meg of RAM, and 32 gig of disk space. Now let's look at performing a clean installation on a new server. Now there are two main parts of installation. The first part is simply booting from the DVD and copying the files from the DVD to the server hard disk. And the second part is the initial configuration tasks, which is also covered in Chapter 2, where we assign a computer name, assign an IP address, and set the time zone. To perform a clean installation, you take the DVD, which has Windows Server on it, and you put it into the server, and you turn it on, and when it powers up, it says, do you want to boot from the CD or DVD? And we say, definitely yes. So we press any key to boot from the DVD, and then it loads the install disk, and we see Windows Setup. We select the language, which is English, then click on Next. We then select Install Now. We could install the Standard Edition Server Core only, but we are going to install the full Data Center Edition server with graphical user interface. Click on Next. We accept the licensing agreement, followed by Next. And here we do not select Upgrade. We're not doing an upgrade. We are doing a clean install. To perform a clean install, we select Custom, Install Windows Only. So we click on Custom Install, and then it says what disk do we want to install it to. We typically install to our first available disk, followed by Next. And then it proceeds to copy the many files from the DVD to the hard disk of our server. And this takes a few minutes to happen. And after the files have been copied, the system reboots. And when it reboots, I do not press any key to boot from the DVD. Then it wants me to assign a password for the administrator, so I type in the password and I re-enter the password, followed by Next. It tells me it is finalizing my settings, and now to log in, all I have to do is hit Control-Alt-Delete. So I press Control-Alt-Delete, and I type the administrator's password, and it tells me welcome, and I am now logged into Windows Server 2012. On the bottom left-hand corner of the taskbar, you will see the Server Manager icon. If I click on the Server Manager icon and then click on Local Server, I can see that yes, Windows Server is installed, but it is using a randomly generated computer name, and what I need to do is to assign a computer name. So after I'm done copying the files from the DVD, then I run the initial configuration tasks, which is also known as post-installation tasks, which includes assigning a computer name, assigning an IP address, and setting the time zone. So to perform the initial configuration tasks, which is also covered in Chapter 2, I go to Server Manager. On Task Manager, on the bottom left-hand corner, I click on the icon for Server Manager, and then I select Local Server, and there is the randomly generated computer name. I click on the randomly generated computer name, I select Change, I delete the randomly generated computer name, and I assign my own computer name, and they also call this host name. I click on More, and I specify the IP address will be ccbcmd.edu. Then I click on OK and OK, and it tells me in order for these changes to apply, I have to reboot the computer. And I say OK, but I'm not going to reboot just yet. Next thing I need to do is to assign a static IP address. To assign an IP address, I select Ethernet IP4 address, and I right-click on the Ethernet adapter and select Properties. And under TCP/IP version 4, I select Properties. I select Use the following IP address, and then I assign an IP address. Then I assign a subnet mask, I assign a default gateway, and I specify the IP address of the DNS server. And for many of you at home networks, the default gateway and the DNS server are going to be the same thing. I then click on OK and close, and I close Ethernet connections, but I don't reboot just yet because I want to do time zone. To change the time zone, I select Change Time Zone. I select the drop down, -5 hours, Greenwich Mean, click on OK. But notice the computer name still hasn't changed yet because what I need to do is to reboot the computer for the changes to take effect. I could restart the computer using the graphical user interface or the command line interface. To reboot using the graphical user interface, well, everybody already knows how to shut down and reboot Windows 7. It's pretty much the same way here. I hit Control Alt Delete, and on the bottom right I select the icon that allows me to shut down or to restart. Or another way to go, to shut down from the command line, to go to the command prompt, I go to the Metro interface and type CMD. To get to the Metro interface, I either press the Windows Start button or I can just press the Windows key on the keyboard. If I press the Windows key on the keyboard, it takes me to what they call the Windows Metro or Tile interface. And to start the command prompt, I just type CMD right here. And that brings up the command prompt. I click on the command prompt. And then to shut down the computer, I type shutdown /R, and R will reboot the computer. I press the Enter key, and it shuts down Windows Server. And then it reboots, and I don't press any key to boot from the DVD. Then I type in the administrator password, and I log in. And then if I go to Server Manager, and I go to Local Server, I can see that the computer name has been applied. So I have successfully installed Windows Server. Two main parts in installation. The first part is simply booting to the DVD and copying all the files from the DVD to the hard disk. Then you reboot, and then you perform the initial configuration tasks, which includes assigning a computer name, assigning an IP address, and setting the time zone. And this concludes our section on overview and installation.